This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 362, Progressive Web Apps. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about progressive web apps with Alex Borsody and Wilfred Arambhan. Alex has been a software developer for over 15 years and tries to bridge the gap between reliable, established technologies and modern advancements. Working as an architect, he focuses on bringing different technologies and methodologies together to create the most efficient teams. He researches and pushes the boundaries of the CMS, PWAs, and native apps with Moonraft. He is the technical co-founder of CarbonPay. Wilfred works as a technical lead for Moonraft Innovation Labs, and he has been involved with Drupal for over 8 years and loves talking about open source technologies. Alex, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Also, Wilfred, thank you for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited.
I'm Nick Laughlin, and today my co-hosts are John Picozzi, Solution Architect for EPAM.
Wait, what? I'm a co-host today? Oh, hi everyone.
And joining us for the third week, Kathy Thays, Support Team Manager for Lullabot. Welcome to the show.
Hi, it's nice to be back.
Okay, we do have a new module of the week. John, you want to tell us about responsive tables filter?
Oh my God, I do. So I was doing some research into tables in Drupal, and specifically just like WYSIWYG and what you can do with tables, and looking for a good set of modules to enable a content editor to be able to put a table into content and have it be responsive and do a bunch of different stuff with it. So I found a couple of modules, and I'm going to give you one now, and we'll probably save one or two for a future module of the week. But the responsive tables filter is exactly what it sounds like. It's a module that actually makes your tables responsive, and it does this through your input filter. So it leverages the Filament Group's table saw approach to responsive tables. And what you do is you install the module, you enable the module, and then you go into your input format and you turn on the responsive tables filter basically there. And then what it does is any field that uses that input format, it will actually responsify your tables. And how it does this is you can actually set, it has like, I want to say 3 or 4 different ways that it will make your tables responsive. And those different ways are basically just different displays for the table. So like, for example, one is to add a scroll effect to your table so that it shows that there are additional table cells off the screen, and somebody could either take their mouse or their hand and scroll it, hand if it's a mobile device. Another one is that it adds like a little pager widget to your table, so you can click next and it'll move over in the table incrementally. So it does some pretty interesting things to make those tables responsive, and allows you some pretty good control over kind of the front end output of the table. So I thought that was an interesting module, and thought I'd share it just because, maybe somebody else is trying to do fun things with tables in Drupal.
Yeah, totally. That's pretty cool. I'll have to check it out. I've been doing some work with tables recently myself. Does it work with any, like if you build a render array for a table, can you apply this to it? If it's like a custom module?
If you build a render, yeah, I guess if you were using that input format, you could use it, or you could maybe tie into the module to use it directly as opposed to through the input format. But yeah, I mean, it specifically is a filter on the input format. So I think you have to use that input format somewhere.
Interesting. Well, thank you for that. I'll have to check that out. Maybe we'll have another update in a future episode. So moving on to our primary topic of the week, we're talking about progressive web apps. We always start with the simplest question. Alice, can you start by telling us what a progressive web app is?
It's actually the most complicated question you're going to ask, because it's a misnomer. Basically, a PWA by definition it's just a service worker, a manifest file. And I'm going to pull up my slides because it goes in order. And then you need HTTPS. You have those three things, and by definition, you're a PWA. And that's why people say PWAs, they only work on Android, because that manifest file, which has the add to home screen, that only works on Android. There's a whole lot more than that, right? When you think of PWA, you're not just thinking about offline, add to home screen, HTTPS. People think it's an app. It's a progressive web app. My website's turning into an app. That's why there is a lot more to it than that.
So am I fair in saying, like at its like simplest form, right? It's like a website that you can use like an app that has some sort of like offline component to it?
I mean, by definition, all PWA is you get that green check. You'll get that green check mark in Lighthouse score if you have the manifest file with some markup that allows you to add a home screen and change like the browser UI to like different colors, and then you get the splash screen. So once you have that, you got the HTTPS, SSL, and you have the service worker for offline, and it works offline. And you have either the page cache that you show, or if the page isn't in the cache, then it will have an offline screen. At that point, you have a PWA.
It's so interesting to me.
The green check mark that says PWA in Google, but I believe that's a misnomer, because what a PWA really is and what it can be is it's using the browser. We have two browsers that we care about. We care about WebKit, which is Safari, and we care about Chrome. Sorry to the others, but that's what runs on mobile devices. Chrome is based on Blink. So we're talking about those two browsers as a platform for your app, and running on a native device and running on your device. And that's really what I'm trying to push forward in what we really should start thinking about when we're thinking about progressive web apps per se. So
it's interesting to me that HTTPS is part of that definition. I mean, I'm super curious about that. But before we dive in further, Wilfred, do you have anything to add? Like, what do you consider a progressive web app?
So pretty much agree whatever Alex has mentioned right before, but just on a layman's terms, right? We do have a lot of customers coming up saying, hey, we need PWA along with our website, but at the same time they're also pretty much scared of, hey, is this going to take much of an effort, right? So for the audience, a layman's term, PWA is just like a website. It is a website, and it's in fact an all-in-one solution where you can deliver your website across all the devices, right? And it just acts, even though it's not a native mobile app, it just takes the advantage of all these features without the end users requiring to visit an app store, maybe taking a purchase, downloading the software locally. So yeah, that's what in my opinion PWA is having a greater advantage compared to the other native apps.
Totally, but what it can be is that, and we can get to that, is that it can run in the app stores, and then we get into wrapping it in WK WebView using native iOS code, or what Google is facilitating through Bubble Wrap and TWA, which is Trusted Web Activity, which is basically they're just saying, Google just pushing it forward, saying, get your website in the App Store. But for iOS, there's some workarounds. But at the end of the day, taking it one step further from what Wilfred mentioned as, pretty much the definition is it can be in the app stores too. The browser is, there's more capabilities coming up for the browser every day. There's something called Project Fugu, which you can Google by Google, which is pushing forward basically browser capabilities and making the web more app-like. And you mentioned responsive table filters module, which uses TableSaw JavaScript library. And tables are notoriously one of the hardest things to translate to mobile. So a table saw module kind of looks at like what does an app do, and they give you 3 different options that you can toggle between, and at that point, your website is starting to look more like an app. And I've actually used table saw as an example of app-like behaviors. Me and Wilfred just did a presentation. He has a lot of experience with different web technologies, and he's wondering, I don't really know that much about PWAs. And I said, you're one of the best web developers I know. You're always looking at new web technologies. You're pushing forward this app-like web development agenda. So essentially, beyond the definition of just offline add to home screen, a PWA is a website that functions the same as an app and at times better. And the advantages obviously is it comes from a single code base. And
yeah. So what, instead of asking the next question, which is around like native apps and cross-platform, I'm gonna try to define what I just heard from you in a different way to make sure I understand it, and in hopes that it helps our listeners, right? So like you have native apps, like I go to the app store on my iPhone, I download an app, right? That app is basically running on my iPhone. It's making calls maybe to an API that lives in a data center somewhere, right? So that's like native app, right? The way a PWA is working outside of kind of those wrappers you were just talking about to kind of make them more like a native app, right? Is if I have like a PWA saved on my home screen, it's essentially going to open my browser on my phone and display that website in an app-like form, right?
For
Maybe
Google,
it's still
web activity. If you try iOS, they don't have that functionality, so you need to work around.
Well, are progressive web apps only related to mobile devices? Do you get no benefit from having a progressive web app on desktop? Like one of the things that you hear about is offline. Will a PWA give you offline functionality on a desktop if you lose
Yes,
your
it will.
internet
So it just translates, and Wilfred, you can talk about the Lighthouse score, how it enhances your Lighthouse score as well. So, but yeah, so PWA by definition, the offline functionality. If you look at the Lighthouse score, it gives you a check mark, which some people say helps with SEO. But yeah, it works on your desktop too. So if you have a desktop website and you have the offline service worker caching using this cache API, it's called programmable cache because you can decide what the cache does, what different pages do, and how they cache. Okay. So it's different than the normal HTTP cache. So you have that on your website. It works on desktop too. Your website's all of a sudden blazing fast. So any website I've applied this to, you get the PWA. That's great. I have 2 native apps now. Boom, they're in the app store. That cost, took me a quarter of the time. That's great. That's what we're looking for. But on the benefit, everyone who uses my website, it's blazing fast. They also won't see an offline page. I mean, they won't see which is kind of cool. The dinosaur, the Chrome offline dinosaur. So yeah, it makes a desktop website faster. And yeah, Wilfred, if you want to go into the Lighthouse as well, the benefits of desktop with having a PWA.
Yeah, I would love to hear about that. I know very little about Lighthouse. In my work, when we make a PR, our PR previews get a Lighthouse score. And so I see like all these different lines and stuff, but I'm surprised to see you mentioning it as part of this PWA conversation. So I'd really like to know some more about it, Wilfred.
Sure. So I'll just give you the context here. So we work for a big finance company, and it's a fully decoupled project that we had. And one of their aspect was to have a Lighthouse score in mobile and desktop over 90, right? So to get that score in desktop was fine. It was not that difficult to get that score, but in mobile it was a pretty huge task. So what we've done to achieve that is pretty much right from the basics. So there will be, for example, a landing page which is having a very huge DOM size. So we'd be suggesting them to cut that short, to just split that DOM into 2 pages, for example, just to avoid an excessive DOM size. And Lighthouse plugin, as you know, comes with Chrome, correct? So it's got, when you scan a website, it's got all this report inbuilt in, and it tells exactly, it mentions exactly what to do. And you can go through the reports. For example, it might be an easy thing. You can consider doing lazy loading to reduce the time to interactive, right? There can be some external JavaScript that's loaded on your web page, and just to make an early connection to these third-party origins, you can use pre-connect or a DNS prefetch, for example. Use that. Reduce the image size in order to load this image pretty fast in the cellular data.
So this is
also
site faster, which enhances its app-like native. An app is synonymous with fast for whatever. It's not always the case, but it's one of them.
Right. And especially when you're dealing with APIs, lots of APIs. This can come typically on any decoupled projects. Drupal serving the data, a third party like a React app or a Vue.js app consuming this. If you have got a lot of APIs that's there in your app, you can use, we've used something called as web worker. So this is a JavaScript script that runs in background. So what this can achieve is, on the first page load, it gets all this APIs loaded in the cache, and then right from the next load, it, instead of again calling back to the Drupal or any server, it just renders this data from the browser. So that's what web worker does.
What was that JavaScript library you mentioned?
That's web worker.
Web worker.
The web workers.
So that is a browser. It's a browser capability. So it's probably listed somewhere under this Project Fugu thing. But basically, they're building the browser, have all these different capabilities. I mean, now you're looking at, they have WebAuthn, fingerprint login, they have the service worker for offline caching, and that behaves similarly to what Wilfred just described as the web worker, which is, it also web workers can do something very similar to what service workers do, which is pre-cache and make things much faster. So that's beyond the definition of a PWA, that it is add to home screen, which to me is very boring. Like, there's so much more with the browser capabilities, and web workers, this cool thing Wilfred just mentioned, is one of these technologies that can enhance the browser experience and make it more app-like.
So if you're working on a project or meeting with a client about a particular project, what types of features, if they're asking for certain features or functionality on their site, what kinds of things set off like a bell to say like, hey, this is something that would be a good fit for a progressive web app? Are there particular things that when they say like, hey, we're looking for this type of functionality, that you turn around and say, that means you should look at a progressive web app? Or are progressive web apps something that you like by default, every project you work on is a progressive web app? The question is more like, what degree are you integrating with that API?
Project can be a progressive web app. It's, by definition, you just add the service worker, the manifest, and HTTPS. But I don't like using really the term PWA because there's so much more. So we're essentially making, if they want a mobile, well, there's two scenarios. If they want their apps in the App Store, you definitely want to have the base PWA functionality and then enhance it from there, like some of the technologies Wilfred is familiar with and really good with, and a good web developer can implement. So yeah, goes just beyond just, we want to make this a PWA. It's like, do they want this to be an app? If they want an app, then you can make it look like an app using all these different technologies.
Right. Like you wouldn't take like a marketing site and suggest like, oh, we should build this as a PWA, because like there's no back and forth like interaction, right?
No, but if you wanted to, you could download the PWA module, click a couple buttons and then you have your PWA. That's where you get your base functionality. But if you want an app, then you build on top of that. But you could use the PWA module as a base. Wilfred, you've built a bunch of websites that kind of have this app-like requirements. A lot of it comes with being able to use a decoupled approach and use these JavaScript headless frameworks that some have a lot of this app-like behavior built in. If how would you, and maybe even in the future, how would we respond when? What are you thinking? I mean, this actually can go back to some projects we're working on now. If the time is there, we can build in these app-like enhancements.
Definitely. So typically, what we does is we would add PWA as an extension with a regular responsive website. There can be customers who would be really going with a native app, and who would really require a native app along with the website for their platform. So if that kind of if the customer is more aligned towards app, we would also suggest a PWA along with a responsive website. Right. So with Drupal, the thing what we all love with Drupal is it can mix and match. The architecture can always change. Right. You can always start with a monolithic website. You can slowly shift towards a progressive solution. Then you can always go with a headless solution. So that's the beauty of Drupal. What we have done before. That's the promise
of the progressive, I think, right? Is that what progressive is trying to hint at? Is that you can like start with this thing and then like build? Is that the progressive part?
I think I think naming it like that does actually make sense, but it's just come to take this more strict definition. And I would totally think in like 5 years, this is all going to be cleared up. People are just going to realize my website's as good as an app. How do we get it in the App Store? It's the end.
So I guess that opens up a pretty straightforward question. How long have PWAs been around? Like, when did Google release the spec?
Yeah, this has been around for a year, like at least, don't ask me that, but I know at least 5 years.
So it's been a while.
Yeah, so it's been a while, but in that time we've had all these browser enhancements, push notifications, so many different things. Biometric is that the WebAuthn isn't quite ready for prime time, but anything camera access.
Sure.
There's a website what web can do. If you just Google what web can do, and you'll see all the different basically Project Foo, like I mentioned, browser capabilities, and people are starting to like put this stuff together in one central place, but it's been so diffuse, and all these it's about centralizing it and kind of making sense of
So okay. I guess we've talked a lot about like features and like the main goal here is like if you think you need an app for your website or for your business, right, a PWA is probably a good direction to head in, right? I'm wondering what features or functionality are difficult to implement in a PWA, or if somebody was like, oh, I need to do this, you'd say, well, PWA is probably not the way to go.
Totally. So push notifications. So there's a framework called Ionic. Has anyone heard of it?
No.
Yes.
Assume we know nothing.
Okay, it's pretty. So if you've heard of like cross-platform apps, so they have Flutter, they have React Native. It's different than those. Those are basically, it's like a bridge, and they take you write it in JavaScript or in Flutter. Flutter is Dart. And it takes that code. It's nothing like developing a website. It's completely different language, different process, but at the end it spits out code for your Android, iPhone, and website. And there's a bunch of problems with that. They're working on it, but yeah, that's different.
I've heard of this process.
Yeah, we're not going to talk about that at all.
Like, it kind of sounds similar to things I've heard of in the past.
Totally. Like, it's super popular now. Everyone but I believe it's even, we're web developers, right? I'm speaking to a friendly audience, Drupal developer. We know how to develop websites that are pretty kick-ass. So, that's what we do. There's a lot of web developers around, and we know the benefits of making a website that can work on different platforms. So, we've been through the browser wars. It's getting a little bit easier to develop cross-platform. It's kind of like we're in a new browser war. Basically, Ionic and what WK Web essentially does, it does wrap your code, and it helps you with some of these pieces of functionality that are usually not available just on iOS for now. So push notifications is one of them. It takes a lot longer to do that. That's not out of the box. If they want push notifications, if they want biometric, these are things that require a workaround. They would require something like some custom native code with WK WebView, or
just going directly to like an iOS app, right? Because
or just being like, let's just
SDK for that is like built and established, right?
Yeah, but you can also do that now. That's what they're integrating this native code.
Yeah,
and I've done that as well. That's what Ionic does. And that's what this WebKit WebView is. It's a function. There's a whole bunch of other functions in the iOS SDK that can allow that. They allow that basically you can run any JavaScript from your iOS code and interact with the page. That's extremely powerful. At this point, you're bridging the gap between, there is code functions in the iOS SDK to allow you to, in Swift, to allow you to basically bridge the gap.
So is your position that like native apps or like iOS, Android apps specifically, like should go away, and like PWAs are kind of like the way of the future?
Go ahead. Like, that's what I think.
Okay.
Because it's easier. Like, we're web developers. We're trying to keep our sanity. Like, marketing asks us for something every day, and like, they don't give it, like, the budgets stay the same. So it's like, if that's why they wonder, we just had all these new features. Why is there 100 new bugs? It's, because it takes time to fix those bugs. Because when you add new features, that's more effort. So I don't care how, great your team is, how many resources you have, when you can develop 3 platforms from a single code base, you're going to have less bugs because you have more power, manpower,
it's like, you can develop an iOS app, you could develop an Android app and develop your website, or you can develop your website and use APIs and share data and share functionality with all 3, right? It's definitely a streamlined approach.
Yeah, that seems kind of like the ideal. If you do that and you've got the website, that's the source of these apps, like, then they're all using the same data, or I guess they'd be using the same data even if you developed standalone apps, but then it would be more like through API.
Yeah, you could still
like,
use an API.
Like, if you're not like developing the whole like separate apps, and you're trying to do like the PWA thing, where is that data? Is it in the browser? Is it in the website?
It's a native app. So a native app, you have like a screen. It posts, sends a request to the API, gets the data, and displays it in whatever native framework you're using. So that sounds really similar to React or Angular. You're making a request to an API, and then you're displaying it in Angular. The only difference here is that Angular display can work on Safari, WebKit, it can work on Chrome, and it can work on desktop. So, you can do it any way you want, or you can use Drupal templates. I've made, and Wilfred made the point, which I'm so glad he reminded me of, it's the majestic monolith. There's this whole like school of thought is that, you start with the monolith and then you start cutting away. Maybe you outsource the users to Cognito, Amazon Cognito, or maybe you start decoupling the front end. But you can start with this wonderful monolith in Drupal and Twig templates, and with a service worker, you can actually make it super fast. And I've had apps like this that you can't tell it's not using the latest React. It's using Drupal templates because it has maybe something like web workers, or there's some of these new technologies for offline caching service workers. It is super fast, and it might just feel like it's Angular, but then you can start cutting those away after you have that. And maybe your business is growing, and now you want to decouple and use some of these cool web components. I remember you had a talk on this. That's about app-like enhancements. Your web component.
I'm curious about the level of complexity then, because at its simplest form, a progressive web app does, especially the offline functionality, doesn't seem that complex. Like, it basically caches all the data locally for future use, and that makes it work offline. That makes it work faster, right? Pretty straightforward.
Yes.
But when you start having these API interactions and users using it like an app, like updating data locally, and then it just syncs later.
Yeah,
like how does that complexity scale, and how do you manage? Like, does all of that data resync have to happen in Drupal? Which I assume the answer is yes. But how do you handle data integrity, and where is that data stored locally? How do you protect that data that's stored locally?
Yeah. So there's people working on these things. So you're talking about a browser. Where's the data stored in a browser? So you mentioned background sync, and like having, which is, you talked about on your web components episode, is, you click post, submit, makes a post request, and you're offline, and it comes back. That's a feature right now only available in Android. And that's, your previous guest mentioned, that's like the holy grail. So, I see that coming to Safari soon, but so background sync's difficult to do, but that's even difficult to do on native too. Like, when you're using an app, native website, you need to be connected to the internet. That's kind of just something what we're used to at this point. Background sync is an enhanced feature available now on Android, which would be cool to come to iOS. But so there's complexity, but then it comes back to the fact that web developers, we've been doing this for a long time, and we get things done. The great thing about Drupal is that it works, and a lot of Drupal developers will say, I can do anything in Drupal, and it's true. So also having that come from a single code base, you can get all three. It gives you more time to work on these extra pieces of complexity, and explore these enhanced browser capabilities. So at the end,
you also have
it's pretty fast.
You also have the ability to think of it as like an offline mode too, right? So if you're using a PWA, you could be using it in offline mode with local storage, and then kind of doing that sync activity
exactly
at a later date, right?
Yeah, Wilfred, you just built this really cool application that use local storage, and basically use Drupal templates and just consume an API. And I felt that to be very app-like, beyond the definition of PWA. You want to mention that at all?
Yeah.
Help me out.
Yeah. So I'll just share that. So that was completely built in Drupal, and the role of Drupal was to do presentation layer there. There was a third-party SAP, in fact. Drupal consumes that data, and it just renders this on the Drupal feed. And we had certain requirements to, again, when it comes to performance, always whenever you deal with API calls, there will be performance involved, and in order to mitigate that, we've gone with storing this data in local storage plus Drupal cache as well. So it's if there is a use case where user logs in, a typical portal use case, the first time the user logs in, all these details, all this third-party data, it just fetches and then stores in Drupal cache, right? Not the browser cache, the Drupal cache. And then until the user logs out, instead of again making a full call to an external system, it just serves this data from the Drupal cache. That's one part of it.
Yeah. So
The other part is
solutions.
yeah. The other part is again it just stores some of this data in the browser local storage.
Yeah, local storage
That was done
secure. So just
that was again typically done on pure JavaScript. There's no other frameworks used. But yeah, it was powerful. It is still we have still used the same implementation for a different project again, and it really without using any external third-party plugins, without any third-party code, we could mitigate this problem of performance again.
Sorry, I may have missed this, but just wondering why use Drupal's theme layer as opposed to using.
That's a good question. There's so many different solutions. That's just one of the examples. I wouldn't always definitely recommend that as the go-to solution. In this case, it was the certain restrictions the client has and requirements. They wanted to be on Drupal. They wanted to, so that's just one of the many solutions that can be done. Obviously, when you're building a decoupled app like that, you probably want to look at something like React or Vue, which me and Wilfred just built an app like that.
Right.
So that is kind of what the default. The point we're making here is that there's so many different browser capabilities. You can, almost anything is possible.
Right.
Yeah, that was
interesting.
Yeah.
So let's dive a little bit more into the PWA Drupal module. And Wilfred, I'm actually going to direct this question towards you. What does the PWA Drupal module do?
I don't know if that's.
I think Alex would be. Yeah, Alex, you can answer that.
Yeah, that. I'll take that one. So basically, I found the PWA module. I had a business that we wanted to get into the app stores. We didn't have the native team, and that was as strong as our Drupal team or the web team, which is very common. Especially if you're starting with a website. And by the way, I'm seeing many companies go towards just using a PWA now, just using the web now. So I can't remember which one it is. Yeah, I mean, I can say that TaskRabbit's native app is terrible, while their website is pretty good. So basically, so I found the module. It was great. Nod, wonderful JavaScript core maintainer, basically was the one who took it to the next level. I needed it for Drupal 8, so I ported it to Drupal 8. In that process, I learned all about it, the ins and outs, and how it works. So what it does is it's the base definition of a PWA, and since this module is from about 4 or 5 years ago, that's kind of all people are thinking about PWAs. Of course, now they're thinking beyond that. And that's why that episode that you're talking about with the web components, they're like, oh, maybe we could build a web component add on to the PWA module. Originally, that never would have been thought because a PWA is a PWA. It's offline and it's the manifest file, and it only works on Android. Now Service Workers offline support is available on iOS. That add home screen thing is not there. It'll probably never be there. But I'm not concerned about that. I don't even care about that. I'm caring, it's about the browser. So basically what it does now is it out of the box, click a couple things, and you have that PWA checkmark and Lighthouse. Some people say helps with SEO. And you have offline capability. And you have that add home screen on Android, which for Android users is pretty cool. And that's all you get. And it works.
Just to make sure I'm understanding this, turn the module on. It adds the manifest file, the security, the SSL,
It doesn't
bits.
have SSL, but it won't work without it. It's on the search.
So it adds those bits, and then it adds offline capabilities, and that's essentially it. There's no like nothing additional. It's basically just going to make your site work offline as
And in the
PWA.
process of working offline, it works a lot faster too because it's caching everything. It's making those requests away from the browser rather than.
And you've also got a settings configuration for that module, right, Alex?
Yeah, and there's some config too. If
you mentioned exactly what routes you want to.
Yeah, which routes you want to exclude some routes. It might have wonky on certain routes. There's routes that you might want to pre-cache, so before you even visit them, they don't, they get into the cache. So if you click the URL and you're offline, it will appear, or if you click the URL and you're online, it loads quickly. That's something
that seems like something like that might be a follow-up. Like once a organization starts using the PWA module, they might be like, hey, can we make this a little bit better? And then they might look into some of those configurations about pre-caching.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
So when you're talking about like what the module does, right? It like gives you the Lighthouse checkbox. It makes it faster. It gives you the add to home link. Why? I'm remembering something you said earlier, Alex, about being like 1/4 of the budget, and so I'm wondering if that might be the answer to like why somebody would use the PWA Drupal module. Like aside from getting all those good things that you said, that you both have talked about the module doing, like what's the decision behind just like, oh, it was a requirement of the project that we have this? Like, is it budgetary? Is it staffing?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think there's many people who are really looking for that requirement if they don't know about it. Like marketing doesn't even know about this stuff yet. Like, so it's kind of up to the developer to be like, should I just go for PWA technologies and then build on some app-like capabilities? And would they be willing to us?
Kind of like
in the App Store.
Like years and years ago, I remember, we were talking about mobile first on the web and like how, companies don't know to ask for that in their request for proposals, and that it was kind of on the developers to be like, well,
totally, I remember
the
that.
future industry standard, I'm going to give you this by default. Is it that kind of thing with these PWAs where it's like people like?
Yeah, I remember like with the media queries, like when those first started coming out.
So I guess this leads to the next question is the Drupal module just plug and play? Do you use it if you're planning on going beyond that base definition? Like in these complex applications that you're talking about, are you using the Drupal module or are you building something completely custom?
I use the Drupal module and then I customize it a little bit for the project.
So would it be
put very little work into it? I should probably be more. There's some issues. Anyone wants to help maintain the module, like please on board.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's pretty straightforward as far as what it does now. You just asked for kind of support helping to maintain it. Do you have any plans for future enhancements to the PWA module? Or I'm sure there are plenty of things that you're like, oh, that would be cool to add it. Obviously, time is a issue for us all, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of requests coming, and I haven't even looked at half of them because, it's a project I use for kind of like what I want to do with it, and it does everything I need. But every now and then someone stops by and gets really interested, and we get a bunch of work done, and then they kind of take it, use it on their project, and vanish. So I'm kind of looking for the next person who wants to use it on their site.
But I guess a question, so something that's kind of been percolating in my mind as the show's been going on, it sounds to me, and this could be completely way off base, so feel free to call that out, but it sounds to me like progressive web apps from a Drupal perspective from Google's perspective, are similar to AMP. Like they have some internal thing that they're trying to get developers to follow. So they created some sort of incentive with the Lighthouse scores to get people to follow. And then less so on the AMP side, more on this, it seems like developers saw a lot of the service worker potential and were like, oh, this is pretty cool. Let's expand it. But at its core, it's kind of like Google has some sort of internal thing aside from speed that they're trying to push. And they're using this as kind of a way to do that. And then people are just pushing the boundaries. Is that an accurate assessment, or is that
Google is pushing the boundaries as well? Like they do with this Project Fugu. They understand the vision. It's just not organized there yet under a single umbrella. But yeah, I mean, the agenda, as far as I can see, is they want websites to be the same. They don't have a whole lot of investment in keeping their app store closed.
But I think it's like, Alex, I think I share your vision for PWAs as a replacement to like an iOS app or an Android app. Maybe not as vigorously as you believe it, but like totally. I don't think, like in my head right now, I'm like, PWAs make a lot of sense. And I think Kathy said this earlier, right? Like responsive websites were like a line item at one point. Like, oh, we're going to build your website. Do you want it to be responsive? Hey, here's a line item. PWAs are currently a line item. I think they'll probably remain a line item, but I think where that shift happens is that if you have a PWA, it will work as an app in the iOS app store. Like you had mentioned, Alex, like push notifications right now require like workarounds and whatnot. Like the future of this, I see being more seamless into iOS's app store, and maybe the Android app store goes away and it is replaced by PWAs. But I just see it as an easier way to like have one code base and get it into those places, as opposed to like, oh, now I need to hire an iOS developer to build an iOS app, and I have to hire an Android developer to develop an Android app, right?
Totally. Yeah, you nailed it. I'm probably a little bit more zealous. In native apps, I mean, people say it's closer to the metal. It's like, but does that matter if it's riddled with bugs?
It's closer to the metal, but it's further away from the data.
Oh,
exactly.
Yeah.
Right?
It's not on the web.
And it's like it's a whole nother system, right? Or a whole nother 2 systems or 3 systems, right? Which is 3 times the bugs and 3 times the infrastructure to be catching them. And
I mean, I think you probably still have like a PWA layer in your website that could have its own bugs. But I mean, I think like if you look at it, like, you want to build your website, or, if your website has some sort of user interaction, like thinking in a way of a PWA as opposed to just like, oh, you're going to log into the website or we're going to build an iOS app, makes a lot more sense to me, at least, than like, hey, let's have 3 different code bases.
And it's just more resources, one code base, less bugs. Like there's going to be bugs, but less.
I think there's one other thing to consider too before we wrap up the show, and that is security as well. I mean, one of the more we open up the phone APIs to something like a general website with service workers, the less secure the general, and the more we make, one of the big things is there are insecure apps. There are things that can leak your data. There are problems with, native apps on iOS and Android, right? I'm not going to say that there aren't, but, in general, if something is in the App Store, you can consider that it's fairly secure. Like I said, there are social media and other apps that are, not privacy oriented and very anti-privacy, but in general, things that are in the App Store aren't going to be downloading viruses, right? Whereas if you're just opening up all of these APIs to just any old website, well, then you're going to have to start treating those the way that you treat websites nowadays, where you have to be a lot more careful, a lot more circumspect, and it's moving a lot of that analysis to users. And the closer you move these experiences to apps, I think the education is going to be harder, right? Because if it acts like an app and is like an app, people are going to have app expectations, not website expectations. So it's definitely something to consider. Like, how do you educate users? Like, this acts like an app and has all the same functionality as an app, but it's not an app. It hasn't been reviewed by,
But
the
if
Google
you
Play Store or by the iOS
Yeah,
Play Store.
definitely. So it still gets reviewed when you submit it to the stores. The only difference is that you can make changes to your website without having to submit it through that review. So yeah, that there's security questions there. But the APIs aren't always open completely. So there's something called associated domains, and you guys have probably seen this well-known folder where you put like a key on there and then your native app, and then if it matches the key pair, then you could do things like password management in the browser in your app, and like that you won't get that without the associated domain.
And I guess that's kind of what I was talking about, where like iOS, like the app process, right? If it were more PWA friendly, it would almost be like, hey, here are the API endpoints that we're using. Here's how we're using them. There's a common language there, right? To be able to get into the App Store. So, I mean, maybe there's a way to like recreate that security level, or at least, or at least, I don't want to say fabricate, because that's not the right word, but keep the integrity of that security level, even though you're using a PWA right now. Right now it's a very closed system. So like, obviously like Apple controls that very tightly, but I don't know. It's an interesting thought, right?
We work on the security side. And I mean, cookies are one of the, sessions like that. So using cookies. So,
who doesn't love cookies?
Yeah.
Oh my God. So to wrap things up, I want to give both Alex and Wilfred a chance to add, like, aside from all the things that we've talked about, Alex, you go first, and then we'll let Wilfred wrap it up. Anything you want to add?
No, I'm just a huge fan of the show. Like, you guys are great. This is so much fun. True radio personalities, like. So.
Oh geez, I don't don't know if I want to be labeled with that. Talking head.
Sounds great. Like,
I'm in it.
Just being able to make the conversations run so smooth, and it's just a great experience for me. It's interesting. It's cool.
Plus one from the guest host. I will encourage other people to accept guest hosting responsibilities. It is really pretty nicely run and easy to jump in, I imagine, as a guest.
Oh, shucks.
It's interesting.
Wilfred, do you have anything to add about PWAs?
So they're not
we don't
I don't even want to go into it again. I went over it. There's an article on opensource.com that goes through it. If you can wrap your head around that, you understand like what we're talking about. So like, just read that article, I guess.
And there'll be a link to that article in the show notes.
Yeah. Wilfred, was there anything else you wanted to add?
Nothing much. It was absolute fun, pleasure to have a conversation with you all, and hoping this PWA, whatever we have discussed, it would reach a wider audience, and more and more people would be ready to try this out instead of just shying it away from PWA. That's the main agenda of this.
Yeah, right. Like you'd like people to give it a go, try turning the module on and see what it gets them.
Admittedly, I have tried to build a PWA. I have a local, this was probably like a year plus ago now, and I have a fledgling PWA running. So
well, Alex and Wilfred, thank you guys for joining us and passing on some PWA love to our listeners.
Do you have questions or feedback Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or via email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel. If you're interested in show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and Chad's Book Corner, sign up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support's greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and click in that button in the sidebar that says Become a Patron.
So, Alex, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Hit me up on Twitter at Alex Borsody.
And Wilfred, how about you? If our listeners want to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
You can find me on Twitter at Wilfred Arambhan, and LinkedIn also the same, Wilfred Arambhan.
Great. And Kathy, if our listeners want to get in touch with you.
I'm YesCT on the Twitters and also on Drupal.org.
John, how about you?
You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi, and you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And if you enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Have a good one, everyone.
See you guys next week.